is The Other Side with Damien Coury.
G'day and welcome to episode 4 of The Other Side Australia. Coming up in this week's episode, are border closures constitutional? We'll speak to one of the country's top constitutional experts. And later in the show, we'll speak to our man with a keen eye on the US elections, Ray Rudowski, and we'll meet a new regular on the podcast, the queen of Aussie conservative Twitter, Alexandra Marshall, will join us to talk about that disgusting Netflix film. I want to give a big shout out this week to those of you who've really been supporting us, who got onto the podcast early and have been telling your friends about it. We topped 1,000 views last week on YouTube alone, and several more on Apple and Spotify. It really is terrific to see that this is getting traction so early. So please do keep spreading the word, keep telling your friends to sustain that momentum. We really do want to make this a big success, and I certainly will keep producing it for as long as people want to keep listening to it. So thank you once again for all your support. Oh, and do hit the subscribe button on YouTube in particular, because one day I might even get paid for doing this if you do that, and it doesn't cost anything.
This is The Other Side with Damien Coury, a new podcast for the quiet Australians. Tell your friends to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, YouTube, and all major podcast platforms.
Let's start this week by taking a look at an issue that a lot of people have been talking about off and on since this whole thing began. The question of the constitutionality of border closures, and of other things. This week, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Gillian Dempsey. Dr. Dempsey is a barrister based in Brisbane and a PhD in economics and commerce, just for good measure, who's got a very keen interest and significant experience in constitutional law. Now, this is quite a long interview. If you want, you can skim through it, of course, but I wouldn't. There's some very serious stuff in here. The media and the majority of the public have been generally going along with the rules decreed by state premiers and governments without question, in the interests of our health and safety. Anyone who says the borders should actually be open is usually forced to justify why they think that or prove good reason. Anyone who protests the extent of the lockdown in Victoria is labelled a tinfoil hat conspiracy nutjob. The word liberty, or standing up for liberty, is shunned by the left nowadays as just a catch cry of the right. And people cheer as these guys get carted off by the police. And it's the left, those so-called social justice warriors, usually doing the loudest cheering, which is kind of like upside down world, but that seems to be the world we live in nowadays. Anyway, we should all be worried about the extent of power being exerted by Dan Andrews and Anastasia Palaszczuk and Mark McGowan now, because these out-of-control premiers are most likely wielding power they don't actually have. All Aussies, whether we're politically on the left or the right, or up or down or sideways, we should be united on these issues. These are issues of freedom and free speech and expression that should concern all of us. In fact, I think one of the reasons people are leaving left-wing parties all over the globe is because they used to stand up for these issues and now they don't seem to. That's not to say that the more spineless right-wing leaders are doing much better. This interview looks at the power Scott Morrison actually could wield through Parliament to completely override what the states are doing, but he's choosing not to. So, because this is such an important interview, I've decided not to edit it too heavily. It won't be a usual 5-minute TV or radio interview. That's not what this podcast is about. We like to assume that our listeners have a brain and an attention span of reasonable length. You're special people if you listen to this show, and the world needs more of you. Personally, I found it fascinating. Dr. Dempsey is brilliant and really knows her stuff, so it flew by for me, and I'm sure it will for you too. Dr. Gillian Dempsey, constitutional expert and barrister, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dan.
My understanding is that there are two sections, or at least two sections of the Constitution that are relevant to the question of border closure legality, the main ones being Section 92 and Section 117. So Section 92, firstly, it concerns trade, and it says, on the imposition of uniform duties of customs, trade, commerce and intercourse among the states, whether by means of internal carriage or ocean navigation, shall be absolutely free. It's a slightly unusually worded sentence. What does it basically mean?
It means that within reasonable bounds, the trade between and human travel between all of the states, not necessarily states and the territories, shall be free. It's been considered by a case called Gratwick and Johnson, which is a case from 1945 during the time of war, when there was a regulation that said that for anyone to travel interstate, they had to have a permit in order to go between the states.
Right.
And a lady called Dulcie Johnson decided that she wanted to go and visit her fiancé, but she didn't have a permit. So she travelled from New South Wales all the way across to Western Australia, but she was picked up travelling between South Australia and Western Australia. The magistrate kicked it out, said it was in contravention of Section 92, and the High Court considered the matter and came down, all of the judges on the same side, saying that if you try and stop people from travelling interstate without a very, very good reason, then there would be a breach of Section 92. It expressly considered in Gratwick and Johnson the issue of the problem of the entire country being at war.
Yep.
And it took consideration of the issue of an old adage, which is a Latin adage, salus populi suprema lex, basically which means that the only law or the supreme law is the one which does the best for the population. And it said, look, you have to have some extreme situation in which you would overrule Section 92, and that old adages don't do that.
We're overriding Section 92 now. So the assumption would be that we're doing so for valid reasons that would meet that criteria.
I don't agree that there are valid reasons to meet the criteria. And the reason for which I don't agree with that is that as between the states, it is not necessarily possible on a factual basis to find any situation so extreme that it ought to overrule Section 92. The contemplation of people moving between the states in a time of war is not entirely unlike the problem of having a pandemic or an epidemic. An epidemic is just a pandemic, effectively, that happens to be in one country. We've had within Australia several epidemics which have not any of them overridden Section 92 in relation to people travelling between borders and the freedom of trade and commerce between the states. And at least the states of Western Australia and Queensland in particular have decided to pass regulations which I think extend beyond their power and in conflict with Section 92 by preventing people under any circumstances from coming in, even if they have a good commercial reason. They won't let you in even if you have been tested, even if you've been quarantined. So I think that the factual matrix there extends beyond which is appropriate and adapted are the words that you hear in constitutional law a lot. It's beyond which is appropriate and adapted for the situation of interstate and trade and commerce, and I think the High Court will consider that.
Gillian, what do you think is the reality for the states? Could we have a situation where if the High Court says, look, that border closure that you did back in 2020 was completely illegal, does this mean the states could be facing significant civil suits from businesses that have been affected, from people who've been affected?
The states already could be facing significant civil suits because in many of the health acts, apart from that in Queensland, there's actually a provision, for example, in the Western Australian Health Act, I can't remember the section exactly, but to the effect that if you have suffered loss and damage as a consequence of a health closure, that if you make application within 90 days, you're entitled to be compensated for that loss of damage.
The tragedy, of course, being that any result in terms of damages is going to be paid for and borne by the taxpayer at the end of the day.
Ultimately, that's correct. And usually the people who are bringing the actions are the taxpayers who will in effect be bearing it. So it's really just kind of shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic.
We're really trying to set, I guess, a precedent to prevent future governments from behaving in the same manner with a complete disregard for the Constitution.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because one of the things that the Commonwealth could do, and I think ought to do, is to use the powers it has under Section 51 of the Constitution to pass legislation in relation to any kind of state of emergency or state of disaster, not necessarily just a pandemic or an epidemic, but more broadly, to cover off the bases on the head of power for interstate trade and commerce, which it has under Section 51.1, quarantine, which has under Section 51.9, under the External Affairs Power, which is the Franklin Dams case, they can pass legislation even that would allow the Commonwealth to say, for example, you can't have any warrants which are issued, you can't have any entry by police where there are no warrants issued and no reasonable cause. For example, Victoria's brought in a you can have police enter any time they want to rule, which I think extends well beyond the bounds of constitutional freedoms. And I think that the High Court will eventually possibly consider that, but that will be a long time coming. So one of the things the Commonwealth could do to circumvent that problem is for it to pass legislation within its heads of power to cover off and to create that 109 inconsistency between the state laws and the Commonwealth laws. Section 109 of the Commonwealth Constitution says that if there's a conflict between a state and a Commonwealth law, that the state law will be abrogated to the extent of the inconsistency.
Right, so the Commonwealth law overrides the state law in simple terms.
Yeah, it puts it to sleep effectively, yes.
Yeah. So just going back to Section 51, I mean, this really does answer the question of whether or not the Prime Minister has the political authority to override what the states are doing. He could, in fact...
Well, the Parliament does, yes. Parliament, as that organ has it. As the executive, the Prime Minister doesn't have any kind of powers like the President of the United States does.
But, yes. But
as Parliament, sitting as Parliament, yes.
So if the political will was there, the Prime Minister could pass legislation through Parliament to essentially stop what's happening in Victoria and in Queensland and in Western Australia in terms of these border closures and beyond. Absolutely.
They definitely could do that. And the reason would be that they could pass legislation which they've already, I think, foreshadowed. The Prime Minister talked about designating hotspots, the Commonwealth designating hotspots and restricting travel from those hotspots and to those hotspots. What the Prime Minister could do using that combination of powers, 51.1, 51.9, 51.20 and 51.39, is he or I should say Parliament, could pass it so that all the borders are going to be kept open otherwise than when the Commonwealth wants them shut.
Okay.
And that would be something which is entirely possible and I think within contemplation, because part of the problem that we have is not just with what's happening at the moment, it's what happens with reopening. For example, we have very few cases in New South Wales at the moment. We have no cases in the ACT, but Western Australia and Queensland are still shut to both of those areas. When it comes to a question of what is the requirement to reopen the borders, there's an inconsistency between each of the states as to what they think that situation ought to be. And that could be resolved very easily by the Commonwealth passing legislation saying, you're going to reopen the borders now, and we'll tell you when you're allowed to shut them.
All of this is quite frustrating, of course, for anybody caught up in these issues at the moment, because the reality of all of this is that the states obviously are just behaving as they feel they have the right to behave. The courts take a very, very long time to rule on these things, yet we have seen people being arrested, convicted, and even jailed for breaching border restrictions. How do you think that's going to play out, and how will these people get justice in the moral sense?
I don't think that they're likely to get justice in the moral sense. Justice is something which happens on average in the long run. I think that if the border closures were found to have been improper, the people such as the young lady today who was given a suspended sentence in relation to having snuck into Western Australia will find that their conviction will be overturned very quietly, but that won't, of course, compensate them for the costs of their legal fees. Normally, criminal law doesn't compensate you if you happen to defeat a criminal matter, and they will be out of pocket considerably. It's a real problem. Much as the people who are getting in trouble for travelling more than 5 kilometres from their home in Victoria, it's cold comfort, I think, later on for people to come by and say, oh well, that was illegal.
Yeah. Yeah,
it needs to be contemporary.
Well, especially when it's happening to you in real time, and we're seeing more and more questionable actions occurring in Victoria at the moment every day.
Well, I think that also there's another constitutional matter that should be considered as well, which is the implied right of political free speech. I think that in relation to not just Victoria, but in other jurisdictions as well, the issues about speaking out, such as you're doing, become problematic because that there's been considerations in Victoria about people being found guilty of incitement for having expressed an opinion contrary to that of the Premier, and that kind of thing is definitely well within the scope of the long privilege, as we call it, the privilege of
quite scary
communication. But that's something, once again, which would easily take a year to 2 years to go through the courts. And
has this ever happened before? Is there a precedent for this in any way that you can recall in Australian legal history?
For the incitement kind of comment, no. The only thing I can think of that's vaguely akin to that is a situation of two politicians who are found to have criminally defamed some people in Parliament. It's the case of Roberts. And what happened was that because they were found to have been guilty, according to the courts of Parliament, which most people probably never heard of, they were disappeared into the then parliamentary cells and popped out 6 months later. That's probably the greatest success I can think of in Australian judicial history, and it wasn't even anything to do with the courts. That was just Parliament going off its own frolic and detour. They were later found to have not breached any laws, and Parliament was terribly sorry, but that was it. They were just journalists who happened to say the wrong thing about the wrong person and discovered that you can be disappeared for 6 months in Australia.
What year was that?
Around 1940-something.
Terrifying. Okay. All right. Well, look, that's enlightening and scary at the same time, but it certainly is food for thought, and I think it brings back the...
I will take enlightening and scary any day.
We need to really, I guess, have a forum in which we can debate these issues quite sensibly, rather than just dismissing anybody who raises the questions of liberty and these matters as being some sort of tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist. These are serious issues, and we really do have to be able to talk about them.
They're very serious. I'm really hoping, though, that the Commonwealth will understand that it has the heads of power. It does have the ability to give certainty to all Australian people, as opposed to leaving them uncertain as between the states and waiting on how much money they have effectively to be able to take matters to court, because that's really what affects people. If you don't have money, then you're not going to take things to the High Court because you simply won't be able to afford the risk of losing and facing hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal fees.
Yeah, well, I think the pressure's on, and I think people are looking for some leadership at a national level.
And ironically, it's Clive Palmer who we're waiting on when it comes to the Section 92 matter. So it'll be very interesting to see the outcome of that case.
Dr. Gillian Dempsey, thank you very, very much for talking to us today. Very interesting. Thanks.
Thank you, Damien.
You're listening to The Other Side with Damien Curry.
Yeah, very interesting interview, and it certainly does make quite clear that Scott Morrison could, if he wanted to, bring these out-of-control state premiers right back into line. So they don't operate without his blessing. If you'd like to support the podcast and help us out a little bit financially, that'd be terrific. You can get on to Subscribe Star. Just Google it and you'll find our page by searching on the Subscribe Star site. Just put in The Other Side Australia or Damien Curry and it should come up, and you'll see a number of different ways that you can sign up to sponsor the show for as little as $5 a month. That'd be really great support for us if lots of people did that, and then we could continue to promote the podcast and expand. Okay, so I'm particularly excited today to be welcoming a new voice to the podcast, and it's Alexandra Marshall. Alexandra is very well known on Twitter in conservative and classical liberal circles, and it's a pleasure to have her on the show. Alexandra, welcome to The Other Side Australia.
Thank you very much for having me on. I'm quite excited to be here.
We're going to look at a controversial topic each week with you, things that are blowing up on Twitter. And at the moment, I mean, this week, it really has been dominated a lot by this awful film, French film, that's out on Netflix called Cuties. Can you just give us a little bit of a background on what the story is all about?
Yes, well, who could miss the trending topic of cancel Netflix that's been going for not just this week, but most of the month? The film is a debut film from French-Senegalese director. It's been pitched as a coming-of-age comedy drama, but basically it's a glorification of child abuse. There's been a whole stack of controversy around it. First of all, the posters and the promotional material that came out were highly inappropriate. So Netflix tried to get rid of that. But now that the film has gone live on Netflix streaming, the backlash has returned because the film is absolutely disgraceful. So I don't know if you've seen it, but it's definitely worth a conversation.
Yeah, I skimmed through it, and I've got to say that I was pretty appalled by what I saw. We're dealing here, just to be clear, with 11-year-olds.
And actresses who are playing them. So they're not even, They didn't even hire older actresses, and encouraging them to engage in activities and scripts that they definitely shouldn't be anywhere near.
So in actual fact, just to be clear on what goes on in this film, the poster that was taken down involved the girls being very scantily clad and twerking, doing twerk dance moves, which are of their very nature sexual. So a blatant sexualization in the promotional material. Netflix then pulled that promotional material and replaced it with another image that was used for the French film, which I personally didn't think was very much better, really, than the first image. And then the film comes on, and they try to palm it off, as you said, as a kind of coming-of-age film, an art film, an exploration that is of sexuality, that is sex-positive, as they like to say these days. But it's just completely inappropriate given the age. The dance scene is just horrifying, and there are other scenes in the film which are just as disturbing, if not more disturbing.
I think there's half a dozen scenes that it's not even the moves on their own that is the problem. It's to do with the leering camera. So they might be shooting the girls dancing down the stairs in their short shorts and mini skirts, and what the camera does is go underneath the girls as they lift their legs up, displaying their crotch, overlaid with extremely explicit dance music lyrics that are talking about paying for sex at clubs. And so it's sort of a subliminal theme throughout the whole film of the way they are producing the content. If you were just to turn off the story and look at what's going on, you'd be hard pressed to even take screenshots to explain how bad it is without having yourself removed from online platforms. But for a list or just a general idea of some of the other scenes you won't have heard of online, one of the opening scenes is the girls in a bathroom clustering around a phone watching explicit porn discussing sex acts and rape and male genitalia, which is obviously completely inappropriate for the girls involved. One of them picks up a condom in a park and blows into it. This is like the additional scenes that you don't hear the media talking about, but they're every couple of minutes they're either propositioning older men or trying to catfish people on online chat services. It's just continuous.
As if that's normal behaviour.
As if it's normal behaviour. And there's no repercussions. The girls don't learn anything from their behaviour.
Alexandra, this came out of Sundance. I believe it won an award at Sundance Film Festival.
Yes. So the reason that the film has been picked up by Netflix is that the Sundance Film Festival in France awarded the Global Filmmaking Award, and they described it as an immensely watchable, vivacious young cast. Now, of course, Sundance's co-founder, Sterling Van Wagen, he's currently serving 6 years to jail in life for abusing a girl under 9. So I'm not quite sure they are the best people to be
setting the moral tone for our society.
Yeah. They come out and denounced Sterling's behaviour, but then again, their solution appears to be to reward filmmakers for producing, exploiting children for profit. So I'm not sure how sorry they really are.
All right, now the cancel Netflix thing on Twitter, I want to talk to you about that in a moment. But before we get to that, is this even legal? I mean, could Netflix be prosecuted?
So there is a question about whether Netflix has actually crossed a legal line about the distribution of pedophilia. There have been quite a few people online who are lawyers on YouTube discussing whether or not the film itself constitutes pornography or at least child abuse. And if it does, and if that can be proved, then yes, Netflix would be culpable for distributing child pornography. So they've got to be very careful about this. It's not just cancel Netflix. It could actually be a felony.
They need to get it off pretty quick smart for many, many reasons. Just as we finish off, I just wanted to ask you briefly about the cancel Netflix thing online. I mean, we on the sort of conservative and classical liberal side of things, we don't tend to back cancel culture. We tend to shy away from it and condemn it. Why is this case different?
So I am not just a conservative, I'm a free speech absolutist, and in any other era I'd be considered libertarian, except for 2020 apparently. So if this was in a book and they'd written it down, then I wouldn't have a problem with it. But because it involves an action, which is getting real 11-year-olds to engage in and produce this content, that's become it's an industry, and it could even be a criminal offence. So cancel Netflix isn't so much about the traditional cancel culture of creating offensive material that you would think of like you've seen before, like Gone with the Wind. It's not like that. This is cancel culture because they might have produced criminal conduct and they may have abused children. So it's a bit different.
Yeah, very different.
It'd be like killing your dog on screen to prove animal cruelty and then distribute it. It's different.
Yeah, yeah. It makes about as much sense as that as well. So, not great. Okay, thank you very much, Alexandra. We'll talk to you again next week. I have cancelled my Netflix account, by the way. And if you don't feel that you can cancel Netflix and survive without it, just do it for a couple of months or do it for a month. Just to send the signal or send the message, I think is an appropriate
or even
way
just
to protest.
even just reblog it and get the noise out there online and make sure that Netflix knows that it's not okay.
Yeah. Alexandra Marshall, thank you very much for talking to us. You are on Twitter at Ellymelley, ELLYMELLY.
Thank you for having me on.
You're listening to The Other Side with Damien Coury, your weekly shortcut to Australia's best commentary.
One story that's a little bit complicated that's been in the news this week that we all probably should get our heads around is the ABC's Special Investigations Team story about the federal police investigation into attempts by China to infiltrate the Labor Party in New South Wales. The ABC reported this week that the federal police are investigating whether China's Sydney consulate conspired with a New South Wales state MP's policy advisor in a plot to infiltrate the Labor Party and influence voters. Now, this story's been out there for a while in various forms. The policy advisor is an Australian-Chinese man named John Zhang. He worked in the office of New South Wales State Opposition Labor MP Shaukat Moslemain. Because of the investigation, Mr. Moslemain has been suspended from the ALP, and Mr. Zhang no longer works for him, but Mr. Moslemain is still a Member of Parliament in New South Wales. The ABC this week reported that the federal police had gotten a warrant and they've been accessing communications between the policy advisor, John Zhang, and top Chinese diplomats, and this is the new bit, including the Sydney Consul General himself, Sun Yantao. Now, Mr. Sun was appointed to the Sydney Consulate by the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. There's something we all need to understand about the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. It's a government department in China which, under the leadership of President Xi Jinping, has been taken over by another government department called China's United Front Work Department. And that department makes no attempt to hide the fact that its express job is running foreign influence campaigns in foreign countries. So that's who appointed Sun Yantao to the Sydney Consul. And these communications between him and this former Labor Party policy advisor, John Zhang, are what's being investigated here. So the Consulate General in Sydney released a statement after the ABC report came out this week saying that the accusations that it engaged in infiltration activities are totally baseless and nothing but vicious slanders. Now, this whole investigation is a very big deal. It's one of the most significant joint investigations ever undertaken by the Australian Federal Police and our spy agency, ASIO. So it's a significant thing. It's being watched all over the world and will be followed closely. The ABC also revealed that Zhang has now responded. He's accused Australian authorities of breaching Australian and international law by intercepting his communications with China's top-level diplomats. Apparently, the Australian Border Force searched his computers and phones at Sydney Airport in January, and the Federal Police raided his home, his company, and his New South Wales Parliament offices in June. The ABC says that it understands that his computers and phones contained a long history of emails and messages and records of calls with Chinese diplomatic and consular officials, including the most recent Sydney Consul General, Gu Xiaoji, as well as officials and families at the most senior ambassadorial level in Canberra. Mr. Zhang is saying that this all breaches international treaties concerning confidential conversations with consular officials. The courts will have to decide whether the old diplomatic immunity applies to conversations that diplomats from a foreign country might be having with politicians' offices, and why. In any case, China is even more annoyed with us now, and the ABC says it's been told by senior Australian officials that they think the recent crackdown on Australian journalists in China was retaliation for the investigation. Most worryingly, there are fears that Beijing will take more action against Australians and Australian interests if the Australian Federal Police makes any actual arrests. And what about the New South Wales Labor MP, whose office is at the centre of all this, Mr. Moslemani? It's important to note that at this point he has not been charged with any crime. He's merely being investigated, and he claims he has been told by the police that he is not a suspect in this case. And of course, we need to remember that he himself may be unwittingly a victim in all of this. In June, Channel 9's 60 Minutes reported that Mr. Moslemani had visited China several times in the past decade, and they ran footage of him speaking at various events. Here's a little bit of that 60 Minutes report from June.
The only way for China to reach its potential is for China to force a change to the rules and create a new world order.
With pro-China views like that, Mr. Moslemani was bound to attract great scrutiny. The question about Shavkat Moslemani is why he says what he says about China, and more pointedly, if Beijing is telling him to say it.
Can I just say that the Chinese government should be commended for the immediate action that it took?
In late February this year, as the coronavirus was spreading around the world, Mr. Moslemani was filmed at the Golden Century restaurant in Sydney.
Coronavirus affects everybody.
There, he praised the Chinese government's response to the deadly virus, despite evidence suggesting it initially covered up the contagion, allowing it to spread around the world.
It has spread a little, but because it was contained so much in China, that meant that the rest of the world had not been affected as it would have if those measures were not taken. So congratulations to the government.
We know who are our friends in crisis. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That's New South Wales Labor State MP Shavkat Moslemani, now suspended from the Labor Party while this investigation is undergoing, speaking at an event at a Sydney Chinese restaurant. And that was featured on the Australian 60 Minutes program. I'll put the link for that particular story. It's well worth watching in full in the program notes. Last week on the podcast in episode 3, we introduced Ray Rudowski, our commentator on all things North American and particularly the US election. Good to have Ray back on the show this week for our segment on the US. Ray, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Ray, first of all, we talked last week about what's happening with the polls in the US. I guess what we're seeing now more is a bit of a cultural shift you've been noticing this week?
Well, I think that the bigger story is that the Trump team and Trump supporters are starting to look now beyond the election to find out strategies of boosting the popular vote by getting people to go out and vote, own your vote. They're also exposing or talking more about this. It's very difficult to kind of pinpoint, but if you look at the idea that people are not accurately reporting their support for Trump, then any kind of close margin may in fact be the same as last time in 2016, an overwhelming support for Trump in that state or in that voting bloc.
The margins in Trump, Hillary had a much bigger lead in the polls going into the election. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, and she lost. So
Yeah.
again, I think that there's a lot of questioning of the methodology of polls and whether they're of any value in predicting the outcome of the election or not.
Are there particular polls that are better than others? I mean, I know they tend to have a political leaning, which is kind of weird. So you get the right-wing media pushing one set of polls and the left-wing media pushing another set of polls. It's like these parallel realities that we keep hearing about. What's your take on the quality of the polls and how they're used?
Well, I think that, the daily Rasmussen tracking poll is an interesting one because it looks at the approval rating of Trump as president, and that has been maintained over 50%, 52. So that's an interesting indication of, like, does the country support him? And then
because it's very hard for an incumbent to get rolled if they're supported. Like if you were a candidate coming in and people say they support you, it's much harder to get elected. But if you're the incumbent, people are frightened. They don't want change. And we've got two crises going on in the United States at the moment. You've got COVID and you've got the unrest. So with two crises, people resistant to change and, a decent enough approval rating, you would think the incumbent's not going to get moved. The incumbent's not going to get moved anytime soon.
Well, again, Americans tend to kind of look at, are they better off and would they be voting for positive change? I mean, you've got a situation around the ideas of law and order, which has always been a central theme in many other elections as well. They tend to look at the candidate who's going to provide that rather than the instability. And when you have things like the wildfires with an arson, caused by arson, when you've got situations of unrest in cities, when you've got a lot of other uncertainties around defunding the police, they're going to look at a candidate who tends to be pro-stability, pro-law and order. And that, I think, favors Trump in this situation.
So, Ray, Joe Biden really slammed Trump in his interview with CNN, where he said that Trump hadn't done a damn thing about the COVID-19 situation. So let's just have a listen to that.
He waved a white flag. He walked away. He didn't do a damn thing. Think about it. Think about what he did not do. And it's almost criminal.
And then there was an interesting piece on Fox on the Sunday night show with Steve Hilton, where he listed all of the things that Trump had actually done. So let's have a little quick listen to that.
He didn't do a damn thing. Really? On January the 29th, the president set up the coronavirus task force to lead a coordinated federal response. On January the 31st, he banned travel from China. On February the 6th, he issued emergency rules on infection control throughout the nation's healthcare facilities. On February the 24th, he went to Congress for emergency funding. On February the 29th, he expanded travel restrictions. Days later, he ripped up the rulebook to sort out the testing fiasco created by the bungling CDC. If the president hadn't got the private sector in at top speed, with Biden, we'd probably still be waiting on his precious government bureaucracy to get it done. Instead, we have by far the most tests in the world, and even on tests per population, we're second only to Denmark. Let's continue. On March the 13th, President Trump declared a national emergency just 48 hours after a global pandemic was declared. The same day, he imposed new restrictions to protect nursing homes. On March the 16th, the president mobilized the whole country against the virus. 15 days to slow the spread. That was before shutdowns were announced in the UK, in France, even New Zealand, which our media holds up as having the perfect response.
What's your take on that, Ray? Trump has clearly taken all these steps and done a fairly good job. He doesn't ever get the credit from the media. The assumption is always that he's not doing the right thing just because we don't like him.
It's a very polarized political environment, and it's not a surprise that the other side, the Democrats, are going to attack him on this. And that also,
one of the interesting things that Steve Hilton did was he replayed, and we'll just do it now. We'll replay those clips from the Democrat state governors of Newsom in California and also Cuomo in New York, actually praising Trump. So let's have a quick listen to that and Hilton's reaction to that.
We needed more PPE, so he launched Project Airbridge to fly in shipments of supplies in days instead of months. We needed more capacity, so within days, hospitals were built, ships were sent, in the end not even used. We needed ventilators, so the president again invoked the Defense Production Act to get them made here in America. Not a single person who needed a ventilator didn't get one, and now we're sending them to other countries. We needed effective treatments, so Trump secured more than 500,000 courses of remdesivir. Whatever we needed, Trump and his team got. And no, that is not Fox News state TV propaganda. It's these guys.
The federal government stepped up and was a great partner, and I'm the first one to say it. We needed help, and they were there.
Conversation, commitment, promise made, promise kept.
And again, no, they weren't just saying it to suck up to Trump so they'd get stuff for their state either.
I'm not doing it to kiss the ring. I'm not doing it in a way, that I'm just being forthright with the president. He returns calls. He reaches out. He's been proactive.
Okay, so that's the Democratic governors of New York, the Democratic governor of California, praising Trump for the response from the feds. Yet this doesn't seem to get a mention, doesn't get a look in.
Right. And I think that the American voter is going to just ignore all the noise and look at their own personal situation. And the question is going to be, is the situation that I'm now in any better? Has it improved? Is it moving towards some sort of normalcy? And you're already starting to see that backlash against the same sort of things that are happening, I guess, in parts of Australia, where they're, rebelling or rejecting the lockdowns because they just don't see any reason for them. And that, I think, is the next part of the story. Who's going to be the president or the candidate who is more focused on the welfare and the improvement of life post-pandemic future?
Well, we're seeing some pretty outrageous stuff going on in the state of Victoria, and the Prime Minister does have the power to change things, and he's not stepping up. And he's the Conservative Prime Minister, so he should be the one stepping in and making sure that these states are not overstepping their power, which they absolutely are. We know that from our interview today with with our constitutional lawyer earlier in the show. Ray, I just wanted to talk to you quickly this week. Also, the Woodward book came out. The Bob Woodward, the Watergate guy. What was that all about, and what was the upshot?
Well, it's interesting because I think that it's not a surprise that it comes out 2 months before the vote, and it's seen as this big revelation that Trump somehow mismanaged the whole COVID response. But what was interesting was Trump's response to it. He said, he kind of dismissed the whole thing and said, if Bob Woodward was so concerned that I was mismanaging this thing when he interviewed me back in February, why didn't he reveal it back then? And I think it's an interesting point because I think there's other parts of that book that are much more interesting. The parts where, the various advisors in American military are kind of plotting to undermine him. I think that that's more interesting, especially going into the election and some of the conspiracy theories about what happens after that than this situation, because people will look at it and say, am I better off now than I was 6 months ago? Or is the state that I'm living in preventing me from moving on to a better economic future?
Yep. Well, Candace Owens, the young African-American activist, conservative activist, has her book out as well. So Bob Woodward can do it. She can do it. And I think that was held for timing reasons also. But it came out this week, finally. It's called Blackout. And next week on the show, I'm going to have a little bit of her interview with Ben Shapiro that she recorded this week as well. So we'll take a look at that then. Ray, thanks very, very much for joining us once again on the podcast. We look forward to talking to you again next week.
Very interesting times.
Certainly are. And that brings us to another end of an episode of The Other Side Australia. I'm Damien Curry. Thanks very much for holding out to the end of the show. Look forward to having you next week, where we're going to be taking a very deep dive on the question of herd immunity. A bit of an interesting episode next week. We'll be stepping out of the news cycle a bit more and looking just at this idea of herd immunity. But we will have Alexandra Marshall back. We'll have Ray back. and there'll be lots more fun for you next week. So we'll catch you Friday morning is when we upload, but of course you can listen anytime during the week. And if you want to support us, get on to subscribestar.com, subscribestar.com, and search up The Other Side Australia, and you'll find our page on Subscribestar where you can support the program for as little as $5 a month. Thanks very much for your time. We will catch you next week.